What if true intimacy wasn't just about physical closeness, but about psychological exposure? The kind of exposure that strips away masks and reveals the raw, sacred truth of love. When a man is deeply in love, the bedroom ceases to be just a space of pleasure. It becomes a sanctuary of transformation, where every gesture, every breath, and every silence carries the weight of something profoundly human and deeply spiritual. You see, a man's behavior in bed reveals not only how much he desires a woman, but how deeply he is willing to let her see him. When a man is deeply in love, his approach to physical intimacy is transformed from a pursuit of pleasure into an act of emotional fusion. What once may have been driven by instinct or impulse now becomes a sacred encounter, marked by an unconscious desire to dissolve the boundary between self and other. In this space, the physical act becomes symbolic, a bridge between the conscious and unconscious, between the external world and the internal landscape of the soul. He no longer seeks release to escape life's demands, but rather, he seeks to enter a deeper state of unity, where he and the woman before him are no longer two separate entities but one shared essence. This need for emotional fusion is not a conscious strategy. It arises organically when a man falls in love at a level that transcends attraction. His heart, long guarded by layers of identity, persona, and social conditioning, begins to soften. The archetypal longing for wholeness emerges, not in his words, but in his physical presence. He begins to approach the woman not merely as a body to be enjoyed, but as a portal into the deeper mysteries of connection and being. His touch becomes slower, more deliberate, not because he's performing tenderness, but because he is experiencing her presence as something sacred, her breath, her heartbeat, her subtle reactions. They become maps to a territory he wishes to inhabit not for conquest, but for communion. This state of emotional fusion invites vulnerability, but more than that, it requires the surrender of ego. A man in this space is not trying to prove anything. He is not seeking affirmation or power. He is not acting out a script of masculinity. Instead, he is returning to something ancient within himself, a primal knowing that love is not a possession, but a merging. In bed, this manifests as a desire to synchronize. He tunes into a rhythm, mirrors her breath, listens with his entire body. His movements are no longer mechanical or self-centered. They are responsive, fluid, and full of presence. He is not trying to impress her. He is trying to feel her, to experience her reality as if it were his own. What often goes unnoticed is how this shift affects his inner world. The man begins to feel not only physical pleasure but emotional expansion. Something within him, often long buried or silenced, begins to awaken. It may be a sense of innocence, or perhaps a buried ache, or even a longing for redemption. In the arms of the woman he loves, during moments of true intimacy, he feels safe enough to explore the unspoken parts of himself. And this exploration happens not through dialogue, but through the merging of touch, energy, and silent recognition. The boundaries between the masculine and feminine collapse, and what remains is pure essence. Two people returning to a state of emotional origin, where the soul recognizes its reflection in the eyes and body of the other. In this sacred psychological space, even time feels altered. There is a slowness, a stretching of moments, as if both bodies have agreed to move beyond linear perception. The man becomes less concerned with the climax and more concerned with the continuity of presence. He notices how her body changes under his care. He watches how her eyes soften or glow, how her voice becomes a different language altogether. He does not need her to speak, because in that moment he is not communicating with her mind. He is communing with her soul. It is not merely sensual, it is existential. He feels more alive, more whole, more seen, not because she gives him permission, but because love has unlocked the doorway to his own emotional depth. This is the moment where the masculine transforms. He is no longer the wanderer searching for fulfillment in the external. He has found, if only briefly, the place where his longing dissolves into being, and it happens not through conquest or skill, but through surrender, through the soft gaze held a little too long, through the fingers that trace meaning rather than skin, through the silence that speaks louder than any declaration of love. He is no longer a man having sex. He is a soul reaching out for union. And in that reaching, in that merging, he experiences not just love, but transcendence. When a man is deeply in love, his perception in intimacy expands beyond the surface of physicality into the emotional and symbolic dimensions of connection. He becomes attuned not merely to the woman's body, but to her inner world, a terrain that includes her fears, desires, rhythms, and emotional states. His attention sharpens, not because of lust, but because of reverence. He begins to perceive her not as an object to satisfy a need, but as a subject whose experience becomes inseparable from his own. The moment becomes less about what he wants to do and more about what she feels, needs, and carries with her in the silence between words. His senses, once reactive and driven by instinct, now refine themselves into instruments of listening. The bedroom transforms into a sacred space where she is not just seen, but deeply felt. This attentiveness to her inner world is not built on instruction. It is a natural unfolding in a man who has allowed love to dissolve his self-preoccupation. When deeply connected, he no longer treats her like a fixed mystery to be solved, but like a living expression of meaning to be continuously read and felt. Her body becomes a book of subtle signs, a change in her breathing, the way she tenses, the way she exhales. He begins to track these things, not for performance, but because he genuinely wants to meet her in the space where she resides, and in that moment his purpose becomes emotional presence, not physical mastery. Her pleasure becomes his fulfillment, not as a transaction, but as communion. There is something profoundly sacred in this shift. A man in love begins to awaken the archetype of the healer within himself. This archetype is not about fixing, but about holding space. It is the part of him that can be present with her vulnerability without needing to change it. In intimacy, this presence can be felt in the way he touches, soft, slow, and responsive. It's in the way he pauses when he senses hesitation, in the way he adjusts his rhythm to hers, in the way he notices not just what excites her, but what calms her nervous system. He no longer views the act as a linear path toward climax, but as a cyclical flow between giving and receiving, between offering and listening. His own desires do not disappear, but they become harmonized with hers. He stops leading from ego and begins leading from resonance. This sensitivity is not weakness. It is power of a different kind. It is the strength to be shaped by another person's emotional truth. It is the courage to drop the illusion of knowing and instead enter the space of feeling. For many men, this kind of emotional intimacy in bed can be disorienting, especially if they were taught that their role is to dominate or perform. But in love, those scripts fall away. What remains is the capacity to feel her as deeply as he feels himself. And in that shared emotional field, the connection deepens into something no technique or performance can replicate. In these moments, communication becomes subtle and profound. He no longer needs explicit signals to understand her. He starts to pick up on the smallest cues, a hesitation in her hands, a slight movement of her hips, the tone of her sighs. He may begin to ask questions, not just out of politeness, but because he genuinely wants to know how she feels, and he listens, not to correct or to achieve, but to learn. He treats her inner world as sacred material, worthy of patience, presence, and wonder. That curiosity, rooted in love, becomes the foundation for an entirely different kind of intimacy. This awareness also begins to reshape how he views his own pleasure. It's no longer about him achieving something alone. It's about being in a shared emotional current. Her satisfaction, her peace, her joy becomes intertwined with his. He begins to understand that pleasure is not simply a chemical reaction, but an emotional dialogue. When she relaxes, so does he. When she expresses desire, it awakens something deeper in him. When she opens emotionally, his heart expands in response. In that sacred loop of mutual awareness, the act of intimacy becomes transformative. It heals not just because of what is done, but because of how deeply both people are willing to be present with each other's truths. This is how love turns the physical into the transcendent. A man who is attuned to his partner's inner world is no longer making love to her body alone. He is making love to her story, her energy, her unspoken fears and longings, and in doing so he touches something eternal, not just in her, but in himself. He encounters the mystery of the other, and through that encounter he becomes more whole. When a man is deeply in love, the walls that usually protect his emotional interior begin to crack in the most intimate spaces, and nowhere is this more profound than in the bedroom. Unlike fleeting physical connections that require performance or posturing, love demands presence. It invites a man not only to give, but to reveal, and in doing so he confronts his own vulnerability in its rawest form. In bed, stripped of societal roles, external validation, and the armor of ego, he faces a mirror. Love makes that mirror clearer, and what it reflects can no longer be denied. When he is with someone he truly loves, he no longer feels the pressure to hide behind confidence or control. Instead, he lets himself be seen, imperfect, human, and emotionally exposed. This vulnerability is not weakness, it is depth. In fact, it is one of the rarest strengths a man can possess. It takes far more courage to reveal the fragile parts of oneself than it does to conceal them behind performance. Most men are conditioned to present an image of power, composure, invulnerability. These masks are often necessary in the external world, built as a response to judgment, pressure, and the fear of not being enough. But when a man lies beside the woman he loves, those masks begin to feel unnecessary. They become heavy, artificial, and eventually something in him softens, not because he is trying to impress her, but because he no longer wants to hide from her. He begins to speak differently in that space. His words, if he chooses them, are slower, more careful, more reflective. But sometimes it's not even about words. It's about what he allows to be felt. He might tear up without warning or go quiet as emotions rise to the surface, emotions he didn't even know he carried. His facial expressions may become more tender, his breathing less guarded, his gestures more open. He lets her touch not just his body, but his silence, his fears, and his yearning for acceptance. What he reveals is not rehearsed. It is spontaneous and therefore real. She sees the boy inside the man, the dreamer inside the protector, the wounded within the strong. And for a man, this act of being seen without the need to be perfect is nothing short of sacred. This vulnerability also allows him to receive, not just physically, but emotionally. In relationships that are shallow or transactional, A man may focus on giving because it provides him control, but in love he learns to surrender. He allows her to hold him, comfort him, trace her hands along parts of him that no one else has ever touched, not in the literal sense, but in the symbolic sense. She touches his loneliness, his shame, his past, and because he feels emotionally safe, he doesn't flinch or pull away. He lets the experience wash over him, even if it breaks him open. In those moments, he learns something profound, that to be deeply loved is not to be needed for strength, but to be accepted in softness. Letting himself be seen in this way also transforms the nature of physical connection. His body becomes an expression of his heart, not a separate tool to gain approval or conquer desire. Every gesture, every breath becomes informed by presence. He no longer uses touch to distract himself or to affirm masculinity. He uses it to communicate, to connect, and to offer pieces of himself that words cannot express. And through this presence, he begins to heal. Old wounds around intimacy, worthiness, or rejection begin to dissolve in the face of her acceptance. He starts to believe, perhaps for the first time, that he is lovable not for what he does, but for who he is. In revealing his vulnerability, he also invites her to do the same. The emotional symmetry begins to deepen. Their shared softness becomes a foundation, not a liability. And in that shared space, a kind of spiritual intimacy takes root. They are no longer two people performing the roles of lovers. They are two souls offering one another sanctuary, and it is precisely because he shows his underbelly, his pain, his awe, his uncertainty, that she feels his love is real. He is no longer impenetrable. He is present, open, and emotionally naked. The deeper a man falls in love, the more he starts to understand that the most powerful thing he can offer is not perfection, but truth. And truth is never clean. It is messy, sometimes clumsy, sometimes fragile. But it is also where all real intimacy begins. By letting himself be seen, he gives her the one thing most men withhold, not their strength, but their soul. And in that sacred unveiling, he moves from being a man who loves her to being a man who trusts her enough to let love transform him. When a man is deeply in love, the physical act of intimacy begins to carry a level of sacredness that shifts the entire energy of the bedroom. What once may have been driven by instinct or pleasure becomes imbued with purpose, reverence, and meaning. He no longer moves with the desire to conquer, to prove, or to possess. Instead, he moves with awareness, care, and a kind of silent worship, not in the religious sense, but in a deeply psychological and archetypal one. The woman beside him is no longer just a partner in physical exchange. She becomes a reflection of something greater, a mirror of his anima, the symbolic feminine within himself that calls him toward balance, wholeness, and transcendence. The man who is in love begins to slow down, not because he is unsure, but because he now feels the weight of the moment. He becomes sensitive to how sacred touch can be when given with full presence. Every kiss, every movement, every breath becomes an intentional offering. It is not a performance, it is a prayer. He listens to her not with his ears, but with his body. He watches her reactions, feels the rhythm of her energy, and adjusts himself accordingly. There is no rush, because he is no longer chasing gratification. He is dwelling in connection. He recognizes that the act of making love is not about doing something to her. It is about sharing something with her. It becomes a space in which their bodies are no longer boundaries, but bridges. This reverent quality can be felt in the way he touches her skin. He is not simply exploring her, he is honoring her. The physical becomes the language of the emotional. When he holds her, it is not to confine or control, but to affirm her existence, to let her know she is safe, seen, and cherished. His hands are no longer extensions of desire, they are instruments of devotion. He touches her not to take, but to give, to remind her through presence that love is not just a feeling, it is a state of being that transforms every gesture into something holy. The experience of reverence changes not only how he touches, but how he sees her. A man in love begins to see his partner through new eyes. Her curves become symbols, her movements become metaphors, her body, in its natural imperfection and vulnerability, becomes a sacred landscape through which he connects to the deeper mysteries of life. She is no longer merely attractive. She becomes meaningful. She embodies the feminine principle, the force that softens him, awakens him, and draws him out of his rigid boundaries. In loving her, he begins to reconcile his own inner imbalance. She is no longer someone he wants. She is someone who reminds him of something ancient, something vital, something he didn't know he needed until he encountered her. And this transformation is not just about her, it is about what she evokes in him. In her presence, he becomes more human. He becomes less interested in proving his masculinity and more interested in deepening his capacity to feel, to connect, to surrender. His ego takes a step back. He becomes a vessel for emotion, for tenderness, for communion. This is not passivity. It is a strength that comes from self-awareness and love. He does not dominate the moment. He co-creates it. He does not lead with control. He leads with feeling. And in doing so, he opens the door to a different kind of experience, one that transcends pleasure and touches the soul. The ritualistic nature of lovemaking, when he is deeply connected, is a reflection of psychological integration. He is no longer split between body and heart, between action and emotion. He brings all of himself into the act. He is fully there, mind, body, and spirit. And this wholeness allows her to feel something rare and transformative. Not just passion, but presence. Not just attention, but understanding. She does not feel used. She feels received. She does not feel managed. She feels honored. And in honoring her, he honors the part of himself that loves. He learns through these moments that there is nothing more masculine than softness when it is born from depth, that there is nothing more powerful than restraint guided by awareness, that true intimacy is not the obliteration of boundaries, but the respectful navigation of them with tenderness and awe. In loving her this way, he steps into a more mature, integrated version of himself, a man who has discovered that love is not something to possess, but something to participate in, something to bow before, not because he is beneath it, but because he recognizes its power to transform him. So when a man makes love in this way, when every motion becomes intentional and every breath becomes sacred, he is not just showing his love, he is becoming it. Through her, he rediscovers parts of himself. Through her, he learns what it means to give without agenda. And through her, he enters a space where body, mind, and soul are no longer separate, but one. When a man is truly in love, he no longer approaches intimacy as an act to perform, but as an invitation to merge. He seeks emotional fusion, not fleeting release. He attunes himself to her inner world, not for praise, but because her joy becomes his meaning. He lets down his walls, not to collapse into weakness, but to rise in the strength of vulnerability, and he moves with reverence, not conquest, because in her he does not see something to take, but something to protect, honor, and cherish. In the sanctuary of love, the bedroom becomes a place where masks fall, archetypes awaken, and the sacredness of connection reveals a truth few dare to speak, that the deepest desire of a man in love is not just to hold her body, but to hold her soul.